Good morning. I am Joy Garrett Douglas, the Education and Community Programming Associate at the Dali Museum. We welcome you today. Thank you for joining us for this session of Coffee with the Curator. Today we are joined by the incomparable Peter Tush, Senior Curator of Education at the Dali, who is going to speak about nightmares. But before we talk, please join us in thanking the City of St. Petersburg for their continued support and offering special thanks to our members who make events like this possible. We also like to offer special thanks to our sponsors of the Shape of Dreams exhibit. Thank you to our presenting sponsors, Therapeutic Tommy Bahama Mattresses, the Anatori and Wyman families, and our additional supporters, Aveda, Florida, our airport partners, St. Pete Clearwater International Airport, BNO Creative Labs, Sandy Tarosky and David Zern, and our hotel partner, Tradewinds Island Resort. Please visit our website at thedali.org for more information about our online activities, programming, including these upcoming events. Tomorrow we have an amazing event in the theater, music and art by Fred Johnson. Please look for that and sign up if you can, and many other, a plethora of our amazing events. Be sure to follow us on social media for the latest Dali Museum happenings and Dali-inspired conversations. Remember, hashtag the Dali. Today is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Peter Tush, and former boss and mentor. Peter Tush is the Senior Curator of Education here at the Dali Museum, where he has worked for several decades. Many of you, I know, are docents and are very familiar with Peter, are extraordinaire. Peter's work touches almost every area of the museum, as he is a key interpreter of the collection and special exhibits. He trains our docents, scripts our audio guides, directs our school programming, and works with the curatorial team to develop special exhibits. Over the years, he has been a fixture of Coffee with the Curator programming, presenting a myriad of talks on a wide range of subjects, ranging from women in Surrealism to Dali's interest in ghosts. Today, with this lecture in conjunction with the Shape of Dreams exhibit, Peter is presenting Nightmares and Art, where he will explore the most fear-inspiring territory, our bad dreams, and one that causes us to wake up and our hearts race and often filled with dread. Please join me in welcoming Peter Tush.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I can share one thing that's kind of interesting. Our education team tends to trend towards horror films on some level, and so often in discussion, horror does come up. So Kim very kindly thought, perhaps this would be a topic I would enjoy. Indeed, it is a topic I enjoy. However, timing this month has not been beautifully perfect, and so there's a bit of, I want to revisit a lot of what I'm going to be presenting you today. So consider this a sort of a focused topic that's more or less a teaser rather than an in-depth presentation of the power of horror in nightmares in art. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. As you know, Shape of Dreams is going to be here through the end of the month. There is a lot of programming still coming up related to Shape of Dreams. So definitely, if you haven't had an opportunity to take advantage, there are so many different types of things with music and dance and dining and all kinds of other things. So hopefully you'll join us for some of these other programs that Joy mentioned. Now, the Shape of Dreams, the exhibition, which I think everybody here is aware of, is 500 years of ideas about dreams in art, showing the profound phenomenon of human experience, the dream, as interpreted by visual artists over the centuries. and how radically we change our concepts of how dreams need to be presented on canvas. What I'm focusing on today is a very small part of a larger exhibition. It's the fourth of 5 sections in the Shape of Dreams exhibit, focused on vision and nightmare. Hank's text says basically, nightmare is the subspecies of dreams that leaves us in a lingering sense of horror and foreboding. That intense emotion, horror, that may arise from the images or actions within the dream, or it may exist independently, inexplicably. And there is certainly going to be a number of images I'll share that do embody that idea. But more broadly, what is a nightmare? The show is about dreams. It's not about nightmares. At the Dalí Museum, perhaps the whole show could have been about nightmares, but very wisely, our director chose the high path and found a lot of other subtleties and ways of understanding dreams. But we're here to talk about nightmares, so here's a very simple definition. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine says, nightmares are vivid dreams that may be threatening, unsettling, bizarre, or otherwise bothersome. They occur more during rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, the stage of sleep associated with intense dreaming. Nightmares arise more frequently in the second half of the night when time is spent in REM sleep. Some of the features of nightmares, it's so obvious, but physical discomfort, persecution, horror, or the supernatural. These are the areas of nightmares that affect all of us. And nightmares can arise from a number of different reasons, obviously stress in our lives, ongoing anxiety, irregular sleep patterns, medication certainly contributes to a lot of nightmares, and perhaps the most significant, mental health disorders like PTSD. All of these things are contributing factors to different levels of nightmares that we might be experiencing. And just a simple observation, what's the difference between a bad dream and a nightmare? Essentially, a bad dream you will sleep through, a nightmare will wake you in a cold sweat, and you will be like this poor gentleman caught off guard and not ready to go back to sleep. There's a really interesting lecture by George Luis Borges, Nightmares, and he just says basically one simple statement is that where dream is the genus, nightmare is the species. Much, much more specific. He recounts 2 of his dreams, or 2 of his nightmares, and then he recounts 2 nightmares from literature, and it's just absolutely gripping stuff. Jacques Lacan has really taken an interest in the fact that although nightmares are the most extreme experience we can have while dreaming, we rarely really talk about them in a kind of clinical way. He says, the experience that is the heaviest, which is never reconstituted, an ancestral experience, flung back into the darkness of ancient times from which we're supposed to have escaped, but which bears out a necessity that unites us to these times, an experience that's still current and which, most curiously, we don't speak about anymore except very rarely, the experience of the nightmare. And that's a very good way to kind of set up the theme of this talk. And one last thing to share before we get on to the images. According to this particular survey, there was 2,000 people surveyed. The 2 most frequent reported nightmares, which is something I think probably many of you and myself can identify with, falling and being chased. Those 2 nightmares are universal. Not surprisingly, though, it says, and 50% also say death, feeling lost, or feeling trapped. And that almost goes without saying. So we will experience some of these ideas in the images I'm going to be sharing with you. Before we do that, though, I just wanted to share that Joy came to me and said, before your talk, we should really do a nightmare tapestry upstairs. Use the Dream Tapestry Interactive and just have one of your nightmares presented to us. So I've incorporated that into the talk right here. So the nightmare that I wrote, that she went up and wrote into there, turns out I wrote too much, and so there were 2 versions of this. I'm traveling through an old group of connected buildings. It's an abandoned part of the neighborhood. I'm fleeing something that forces me to keep moving. It's a Kafkaesque environment with no clear escape route. And this is the image that was generated upstairs. One of the things, just many of you, I'm sure, are very aware of this, but sometimes the generated image will include these very curious stamps of statements, word-like constructions, where it has remembered the way letters look, but it doesn't understand how to construct words. And so you get these very strange sort of references here, like the one on the bottom, which in and of itself creates a certain sense of anxiety and fear, and perhaps can wind up in your nightmares. The nightmare goes on, the space is tight and changes from industrial tunnels to small dingy rooms to narrow walkways. I'm lost and see no people, but the dingy environment keeps changing. And so bringing those two together, this is a pretty accurate view of my nightmare as I shared with the interactive. I encourage you all to find your own nightmares to embody in visual images, but I just thought we'd start that off. So now we're just going to be looking at some of the, I guess you could say, the highlights, the big stars of nightmarish imagery through the visual arts. And we're going to begin with sort of the master, the leader from 500 years ago, Hieronymus Bosch, and the Netherlandish Catholicism of nightmares. And I'm just going to look at his triptych of the Temptation of St. Anthony from 1501. It's in Lisbon. It is an extraordinary image. It certainly rivals the Garden of Earthly Delights. It is a compendium of horror in just such a vast array of imaginative reinterpretation and symbolism that it just engrosses every person that encounters it. We're talking about nightmares. I think this certainly can be characterized as a nightmarish image. It doesn't mean that this is a dream that he experienced that he needed to put on canvas. It's much more consistent with many of the images upstairs, which provide correctives to the individual. Give you some nightmare images that show if you go astray, these are some of the consequences you may have to face. But the sheer array, the encyclopedic litany of ideas that he shares in this painting are extraordinary. So I'm just going to walk you through a few of the highlights, some memorable images that will stay with you, hopefully in your nightmares. This is one of the details from the left panel. It's the detail in the sky where these demonic bird-like fish are bringing St. Anthony down to earth to suffer the consequences of the temptations that he's about to have to undergo. So he's the figure that's being carried down by these demons in the center. You can tell he's moving towards the earth. And when we go to the detail a little bit further down, this is actually the Saint's Grotto. I'm not sure how much is clear from this. There is a building structure that's actually a person's behind. That's the entranceway into the grotto. And there is a group of figures on the bottom right-hand side, including a demon dressed as a cleric and a deer in cleric clothing that are on a procession to the Saint's grotto. And there's also this absolutely fascinating sort of fish within a fish that is also a mobile building of some sort with wheels that is just strictly out of the imagination of Bosch, but all suggesting the hellish world that we are facing through our inability to keep our temptations within check. So all kinds of curious and exotic horrors that he's prepared for us. I'm going to do this slightly out of order. At the very bottom, there's a bridge on the left-hand side. Below that bridge, there's a cleric and two animals that are reading some sort of letter or missive. And there's this very curious character on skates with a funnel on his hat who is carrying some sort of brief, some small note or envelope. And apparently the lettering on this is a reference to the fact that during this period of time in the 1500s, there were a lot of people who would pay for having elevated status within the church. So you would pay to get an elevated position, and this is a reference to that. So the idea of using cash in order to control your elevation within the church and your closeness to God. So that was seen as one of the great heretical sins, and so that's included. And right above this group of characters, we find poor St. Anthony, who has collapsed. He's being supported by these two monks and a third figure in red, who many feel is a self-portrait of Hieronymus Bosch, helping the saint after some of the first temptations that he had to undergo. So now we move into the center panel. There's a lot of detail here to look at. I'm not sure how much of it you can see clearly, but right in the very center under that woman, that's St. Anthony. He's praying, and you can see in this little cloistered building that's ruined, there's an image of Christ on the cross. So he is in Mass, he is in prayer, he is devout. Not a single other person looks to Christ on the cross. Everyone is looking away, and there's a mockery of religious ideas all around him, including this table right next to him, where there's sort of a mockery of the Mass. And there's a pig-faced figure that's kneeling there. He's about to be pickpocketed by somebody behind him. There are demons laying out arrays of food related to the Eucharist and the blood of Christ. And then down here, this is at the bottom left-hand side, there's this big red piece of fruit that's ripped open, and that's where the devil himself, Lucifer, comes out with this sort of skull, animal skull under the large shawl, playing the harp, riding on some sort of perverted chicken, I suppose, might be the best way to say it. There is a nun-like creature in a basket that's being held onto the back with a large saber. And then one of the things that's been pointed out, there's a gentleman with a top hat, and he's been referred to by several people as being like the magician who potentially might be causing these visions to happen. So trickery and the consequences of temptation. And then finally, just the last image to share on the bottom right-hand side on the third panel to the right, there is another table arrayed as if it was in a Mass setting. There's bread, there's wine, so it's the Eucharist, body and blood of Christ. And there are demons and nude figures underneath the table supporting it, mocking the Mass. And the one gentleman has his foot within a vessel, which is a reference to sexuality. So all of these incredibly, brilliantly horrifying images that will affect us in our nightmares and lead us, hopefully, to lead the correct life, not by wayward sin. Also, one other thing just to share before we go back, in the background here, right behind where the Mass is being held, you can see the village is under fire. St. Anthony is identified with St. Anthony's fire. He is the saint who comes in and intervenes for people who suffer from ergotism or the hallucinations brought on by funguses that will lead to hallucinations of being on fire. And so this fire in the background is a reference to one of the things that he is very helpful about. Which brings us to two other figures from the 1500s and the 1600s. So still continuing nightmares on canvas. This is Grunwald and Borgiani. And we're going to start with Matthiasgruenvald. I think you could argue that this particular painting, the amazing Isenheim altarpiece, is a bit of incredible realism rather than a nightmare. It's not a dream like what we saw with Hieronymus Bosch of horror, but rather it is perhaps the most horrifying image of Christ suffering. And what's interesting is that Isenheim, the church, was run by a group of St. Anthony followers, and they administered to people who suffered from skin diseases, in particular St. Anthony's fire. And it's been pointed out that the body of Christ here is ravaged by almost every known type of illness and disease that people would suffer from. The idea was that you're suffering, you're here at this church, Christ knows you're suffering and knows it tenfold. And so it's a way of finding some sort of, not necessarily peace, but identity with Christ, that he suffered even more than you are suffering for your sins. And so there's a sense of the ultimate incredible realism of the body that's lacerated with all of these different types of illnesses, makes it more horrific than any nightmarish image you could imagine. And thus, it becomes an image for nightmares. So this, again, it's in Colmar, Alsace at the Unterland Museum, but it is part of a much larger scenario. It is the antithesis to Dali's crucifixions, and Dali noted that he was the person he was responding against because these were so viscerally horrifying as a way to understand how Christ suffered. And then we bring ourselves to the third painting, The Vision of St. Jerome by Orazio Borgiani from 1600 to 1630. We have an image of this upstairs. It's from the Louvre Museum. And it's interesting because St. Jerome is the very, very well-read scholar who takes the Bible and translates it into Latin and makes it available for many. And he is a incredibly wise individual who's often presented in a celebrated way as the man who understood what needed to be done with the translation into the Vulgate version of the Bible. But here we have the moment that he shares about a vision he had where indeed his enthusiasm for the classics, figures like Dante, he suddenly realized that he was being judged by God himself, that those were distractions from his correct purpose. And what's presented here in this horrific image is the consequences for being distracted by the classics is that you will be whipped mercilessly by angels who come down to set you on the right path, on the virtuous path. Certainly a horrific dream, a horrific nightmare that hopefully none of us have to experience. But clearly it worked. He wrote the Vulgate version, did the translation, and the world changed. So this is one of those powerful nightmare images from the 1600s. Now we're going to move forward into the cult of nightmares with Fuseli and the emergence of Romanticism. So we're at the end of the 1700s, moving into the 1800s. Henry Fuseli is a Swiss artist who is often associated with doing very accurate illustrations of stories by Shakespeare and other great writers. He was very deeply influenced by Michelangelo. He loved the idea of the relief form of the human body. And we come suddenly in 1781 to this painting. And what's remarkable about it is there is no literary antecedent that he's illustrating here. It's been noted that I guess he had had a falling out with a woman that he wanted to marry. Her uncle disapproved of him and said that the relationship was off. It's thought by some that perhaps this is the outcome of that. He's purging her from his life. But it's a remarkable and truly haunting work that I think has affected centuries of artists since this time. And also, of course, writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Shelley were deeply influenced by this painting. We have a woman in white, suggesting innocence, asleep on a large bed, and she is almost kind of that kind of hysterical pose, that classic pose of hysterics. There is a terrifying eyeless horse that's swinging around from behind the curtain, and on top of her chest, we have this imp, this incubus, this elf, this creature, trollish creature that is truly terrifying and ugly and perversely fascinating. And part of the idea, this is obviously predating Sigmund Freud. It's very important to know that Sigmund Freud not only appreciated the image, but had a copy of this image in his Vienna studio. So it's one that inspired him into the kind of madness that runs through our minds and the kind of nightmarish sensibilities that we have brought about by a variety of different things in our lives. But this is clearly also suggests a kind of sexual horror, the idea that perhaps the incubus is not only visiting upon her, potentially taking her breath, but also mating with her. And so there's this horrific sense of not being able to control yourself when you're in the nightmare itself. You are completely unprotected from whatever might visit you in your dreams. And it's a really powerful image. It was so powerful that it kind of defined his career. He wound up doing 3 more versions of this painting, which also were all very, very popular. There's another version of it that's vertical instead of horizontal, which is equally compelling. And when he showed this in the Paris Salon, it was absolutely a sensation, leading to a large number of etchings being produced and mass distributed. So in a way, this is kind of the iconic birth of the Romantic movement, that idea of giving yourself over to extreme experiences, extreme states that are anything but rational. And that's really the identification with the nightmare, is the irrational. And this moves us into just one further observation of the power of that image. Almost 60 to 70 years later, Daumier went back to that image and used it in a sequence of other images having to do with a particular scandal about poisonous horse meat that was being sold to the public. And so this was a story noting the horrors of it, and he used clearly a reference to Fuseli's The Nightmare to create this particular image of the horse that seems to having this lightning coming out of his eyes, affecting this poor gentleman who's eaten too much horse meat and is under the nightmarish, clinches of the unconscious and the horror that's attached to that. So the horse eaters. We're going to dive back to the early 1800s again and just look at two images by Goya, Francisco Goya, who was excited and profoundly ready for the Enlightenment to happen, and it really never happened. And the two images I have to show from his perspective show two very different responses to that. The first one, unsurprisingly, kind of the classic nightmarish image, the sleep of reason produces monsters. This is the 43rd print in the La Capriccio's suite. And here we have the rational man, the enlightened man, who has fallen asleep at his table, and it unleashes this horror of all of these symbolic images of animals, the lynx, the owls, the bats, representing ignorance, representing superstitions, representing all those things that we keep under wraps during our waking time. But if we let reason lapse, if we give ourselves over to superstitions, suddenly it can unleash all madness and all kinds of things. So it's that idea of we walk the balance between rationality and the irrational that can always show up at any point. So it's a very tight line that we walk, and we have to be very comfortable with walking on the right side of it. Although he did also say the imagination is essential in order for a complete life. So he didn't say that the irrational replaces the imagination, but rather if the irrational disappears, the irrational will erupt. But then we go 20 years later to 1819, and the irrational did erupt. Francisco Goya witnessed some horrible things when Napoleon's soldiers, the soldiers of the Enlightenment, came and unleashed such barbarity upon the people of Spain. And also he had lost his hearing. He had a son his relationship with was starting to become very complicated. And we suddenly have this painting, which is called Saturn Devouring His Son. This was one of the black paintings. It was done on the wall of the house he was living in, the wall of the deaf man. And it's a return to a kind of classic image, an image that Rubens had already painted. But the way that Goya depicts it, it's much more horrific and much more inexplicable. There doesn't seem to be a corrective suggestion here on how we can live better. It's more of an observation that man has become animals. And the idea is that Saturn has been told that his sons will come back and will kill him and will become, the usurpers. And so the idea is that once each one of them is born, they are devoured in full. The classic telling of the story, though, is that then when he's tricked and he swallows a stone, they're reborn complete because they were swallowed completely. They weren't eaten bit by bit. What we have here is a devouring, a munching, a gnawing on a human in such a graphically horrifying manner that this is the embodiment of the terrible nightmare that is transferred into painting. So it really does influence so many different people, including the ones who I will end with today. Somewhere in between, so we have this horror of 1820, and then we jump to the late 1800s, and we come to Böcklin, and we find a different kind of nightmare, definitely the antithesis of Hieronymus Bosch, and that's The Isle of the Dead by Arnold Böcklin. Curiously, another painting that found its way into Freud's world, also an image he had reproduced and used in a study, but perhaps less curiously or maybe more threateningly, it was also a favorite of Adolf Hitler. So this is an image that unites these two irrational worlds. But The Isle of the Dead is a painting that creates an atmosphere of dread that's very different than the kind of explicit horrors and symbolic horrors of Hieronymus Bosch, or even the kind of direct threat of the inexplicable that we saw in Fuseli. The Isle of the Dead is quiet. There's nothing you can particularly point to that seems to be an image of horror. And yet everything about this haunts the unconscious. There's the figure being carried across sticks in the boat, wrapped in white, seems ghost-like, but also like a shrouded figure. This is the Isle of the Dead, the island of the cypress trees, where there are crypts, and we don't know what's about to happen, but it's the fear of death itself. It's not the fear of the horror or the torture or the torment, but rather the end. And it's a very powerful nightmare, and it really does capture for generations of artists the idea about how something very subtle can absolutely control everything that we think, dream about, and move it into a nightmarish realm. So from this very quiet piece, I'm going to move to two much more alarming pieces, perhaps one of them certainly the most alarming, which is from the 1880s as well. And that's, of course, Edvard Munch's The Scream from 1893 from the National Museum in Oslo. It is an extraordinary piece. It was recreated 3 times in the same way Böcklin had recreated his many times and Fuseli had recreated his many times. Edvard Munch also recognized and was celebrated for creating the most disturbing image of the entire, I guess, 19th century, leading to generations of 20th century artists trying to process that information and come up with a response to it. But The Scream is extraordinary because it is a nightmarish image. It is an image that can dominate nightmares, and yet it is not a painting about a dream he had or a nightmare he had, but rather a waking experience that can only be described as a waking nightmare. He said that, "I was walking with 2 friends. The sun began to set. Suddenly the sky turned blood red. I paused, feeling exhausted, and leaned on the fence. There was blood and tongues of fire above the blue-black fjord of the city. My friends walked on, and I stood there trembling with anxiety, and I sensed an endless scream passing through nature." It's a really provocative, apocalyptic vision, but it's happening during his waking moment, which he's captured here and translated very effectively for the rest of us to constantly reference. In the same way we reference the Mona Lisa, we reference The Scream. It's the existential moment of nightmare, dread, and horror, captured very powerfully. And next to that, a very specific image, one of the really stars of the exhibition upstairs, is Max Beckmann's The Dream. Clearly not just a dream, but absolutely a nightmare, from the St. Louis Art Museum. This was done in 1921 following the World War I, and this was painted under the Weimar Republic, a period of time when people were starved, persecuted. Germany was not exactly helping the underclass to find their way. People had no money, they were living in shambles, they were broken people, and that's captured very effectively in this very claustrophobic image. It's vertical, everything is compressed together. You'll notice right in the center, there's a very unhappy woman who seems to be surrounded by a variety of different, almost acrobatic type of people who all seem to be suffering from various, not illnesses, but physical harm. There are figures without arms and hands, like the gentleman on the stair. There is a woman who seems to have collapsed down here at the very bottom. There's a gentleman playing a music box. There's a sense of just incredible volume, like a calamity of sound that's being unleashed here with all these figures who seem to be blind. If you look at all of them, there's not a single figure with their eyes open except for the woman in the center. So it's like being trapped, and then that's amplified tenfold by the ladder that moves to nothing. There's no opening, there's no escape, there's no release from the compression of the horror that all these people are experiencing. In a way, this captures perfectly the atmosphere of many expressionist movies as well as paintings. There's a sense of being trapped and not being able to get out of it. So it's incredibly effective, and it is the dream, it is the nightmare. From that, we're going to look at Salvador Dali, and that seemed inevitable. I'm just going to show you 2 images, one from the show, one that's not in our show, that very much like Goya, set 2 different tones for nightmares. And the first one I would say goes right back to Arnold Böcklin, and that's Shades of Night Descending. It's a very quiet painting. It is a very beautiful painting. It's unsettling in a kind of slow time bomb sort of manner. You start looking at it and there's long shadows, and the shadows start to become very ominous. And in particular, if you notice the little pebble that has a little bit of light on it, it's casting a darker shadow than anything else, which is very, very strange. But everything about the rocks are jagged. It seems to be a very empty environment, a little bit forlorn. And then you realize that there's a figure shrouded off to the bottom right. And it's a figure that doesn't look like any figure that we're familiar with, because there's actually a high-heeled shoe underneath the top part of the wrap. A little bit further down, there's a goblet that also is accompanying that high-heeled shoe. And then finally, something that you can see very well is that kind of femur, or that bone that seems to be poking out from the side. It's very unsettling, and yet when you recognize it, it truly is disturbing and unpleasant in a much more visceral way. And it's very much like an ancestor from, or I guess maybe it's the legacy of Boclean, where you have that Boclean character that's going to the Isle of the Dead, has now been transformed and placed into the environments of Dali's rocks, which he said, the environment where he lived, he said he would enjoy sitting there for hours, watching the shadows play on the rocks, creating new nightmares. And so there is that sense that Dali identified his landscape with nightmares. So from this very quiet, unsettling, anxiety-ridden piece, we come to Dali's most explicit image of horror for his entire career, and that's the soft construction with boiled beans, premonition of civil war. And this piece clearly, I don't think, would exist without Goya's Saturn devouring his children. This one's from 1936. It was painted and completed just as the Spanish War broke out. It received that second part of the title of Premonition after the war broke out, and it was, Dali added it to the painting. But this is perhaps the most shocking image, other than perhaps Guernica by Picasso, of the 20th century. It's just one of those paintings that so perfectly allowed Dali to use all of his skill to create the most nightmarish image of horror that he could possibly accomplish. And so you have this representation of possibly Spain tearing itself apart, ripping itself to shreds, pieces of raw meat are spilled about in the environment. It's this incredible kind of green, nauseated color that surrounds the breast and the sky. And then there's a gentleman down here by the large hand who seems completely unaware of everything around him. And Dali's basically saying, you know, there are those who have no sense of the very horrors that they're living through and witnessing. So incredibly powerful variation on that idea of Saturn devouring his children from Salvador Dali. And now just to finish up, wrap it up, I'm going to share a little bit about this particular powerful image by Wilfredo Lam, also called The Dream. Number of different ways to understand and approach this painting, but definitely it's connected to his awareness from the Caribbean of the rites of voodoo and Santeria. Wilfredo Lam was very close with Pablo Picasso when he went to Paris at the end of the 30s and early 40s. Picasso connected with him, they worked together, and it led him to produce some of the most amazing images between the late 30s and late 40s. This is a piece from the Hirshhorn Museum, and he has a quote that I'm just going to connect with this because I think it exemplifies the types of things he was trying to accomplish with his work. He had returned from Europe to the Caribbean and to his home in Cuba, and he was horrified by what was happening with the way it had been, the culture had been exploited by the West, particularly the United States. And he said, I wanted with all my heart to paint the drama of my country, but by thoroughly expressing the Negro spirit, the beauty of the plastic art of the Blacks. In this way, I could act as a Trojan horse that would spew forth hallucinating figures with the power to surprise and to disturb the dreams of the exploiters. So this is an image of a nightmare that he is hoping infects the Westerners who have taken over the country he knew so well and have turned it into a cash cow. And he wants this to destroy them in their nightmares, which is a very powerful idea. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about very briefly are perhaps the most disturbing and repulsively funny artists of the 21st century, and that's the Chapman Brothers. The Chapman Brothers are extraordinary. I'm going to just talk about one particular project. This is a diorama that was presented, I know in China, I believe it was also presented in England, but I'm not sure which gallery. In 2012 and 2013, this was presented. It's called The Sum of All Evil, and it's a hellscape diorama. There are 4 aquariums, each one massively, densely filled with toys and cartoon characters. And it is trans-historical. So there are images that go back to the dinosaurs. There are images that go to spaceships. It is like a child's imagination run rampant, but the most important thing is that they are explicitly calling out the barbarity, the apocalyptic tone of living through the late 20th century and the horror that we unleash upon each other. One of the dioramas is particularly focused on Baba Yar, which is in Kiev, where they discovered that 30,000 Jews were massacred in 2 days by Nazis before they left. You know, that's the kind of horror that is informing this particularly repulsive and very funny diorama. So here we have one of the close-up shots. You have Nazis, you have the Hamburglar, you have Ronald McDonald, you have skeletons, just inexplicably, horrifyingly, entertainingly presented in a way that you can't look away. Again, it's like a car accident magnified 100-fold. This is perhaps the most horrifying and at the same time amusing of all the images. This is the crucifixion of Ronald 100 times forward, many, many bodies that are being stepped upon. It is the image of nightmares, I think, in the 21st century. Doesn't mean you need to like it, but it is out there. They did almost win the Turner Prize. There is something about their work, as unpleasant and repulsive as it is, that keeps us looking at it and talking about it and just, scratching our heads. But the unleashing of the nightmares, it is the sum of all evil. It's the return of Hieronymus Bosch to a 21st century culture. So with that, let me just offer just a few words, which is that, from looking at this from Hieronymus Bosch to the Chapman Brothers, Salvador Dali, Goya, some of the most compelling and vivid images of all of art history focus on nightmares. Often they're used as correctives to try to set us on the right course, but sometimes perversely they are just recording the anxiety that we all live through as humans. They color our imagination, they obsess us, sometimes they break us, but it is an absolutely fascinating, compelling area that I hope at some point in the future I get to do a little more with. So thank you all for coming today. And if there's any questions, happy to answer. Oh, yes.
Whose nightmare is this?
This one here, this is Henry Fuseli. He's the, oh, absolutely. That is the question. Is this the woman's nightmare? Or is this the artist's nightmare thinking about the woman he had been with? I think it's very ambiguous, and that's part of the anxiety that doubles down on the nightmarish quality of the painting. But yeah, there's no clear idea about whose nightmare this is. Is it the imp, which would be kind of interesting, not very convincing, but kind of an interesting alternative as well. But definitely some threatening things are happening. Any other questions? Yes, John.
In Dalí, in the three ages and slave market with the disappearing vegetables there, I had assumed that the ruining buildings in the background came from the Renaissance paintings of nativities. The Roman buildings are decaying because Christ is here, the old is passing away. Did I make that up? Did he also pull from Bosch in the burning cities? Or did he just, is it independent of any sort of art history reference?
So the question is, just if you weren't able to hear, in Dalí's paintings, like the slave market and like the three ages, there are ruins that are part of the illusion that Dalí's able to amplify. And there is certainly a very explicit connection to Leonardo da Vinci and the idea of the nativity with architecture that's in partial ruin that also is part of a visual landscape. But very clearly also, there are these amazing Hieronymus Bosch paintings that also have these ruins that are in flames that also seem to be very similar to what Dalí created. I would say both of those are very, very clear in Dalí's mind. he's never said that I was thinking of this painting or I was thinking of that painting. The Adoration of the Magi by Leonardo da Vinci is the one often referred to, but I think Hieronymus Bosch, Dali knew backwards and forwards. So it's very fair game to say that both of those ideas are animating his approach to those. So yeah, I don't think they come innocently from anywhere, but I do think those two sources are the primary ones. Yes.
If they can understand how surrealists interpret dreams to understand reality, how did they interpret nightmares? What did surrealists think of nightmares?
So the question is, we have surrealism, and we have the idea that surrealism were able to take dreams, the irrational aspect of the human consciousness, and make that really their focus for their body of work. So how do nightmares fit into surrealism? And I was really that's the next part of what I would like to focus on further, because there was an exhibition a couple years ago focusing on the idea of surrealism and dreams. And it's vast, and it was filled with so much information. And there were very, very fine lines between when does a surrealist painting move from dream to truly nightmarish. And I think there's a lot of subtlety to it. And I don't think it's always very clear. I think some of the most unsettling dreamlike images from surrealism, like a Rene Magritte, could be argued to be nightmarish, but none of them are nightmarish in the way that, say, the Premonition of Civil War by Dalí is. That seems monstrous, and there's not a lot of truly monstrous surrealist paintings. So I think that they spent a lot of time in the world of dreams. Nightmares start to come out more through anxiety or references to the war, which would be the idea of horror. There's definitely references to World War I and eventually II through the surrealist work. Arthur?
Would you also say that might be the influence on Chance de Maldoror?
Oh,
Pretty nightmarish to me.
yeah, so what he's mentioning is a writer that influenced not just Dalí, but the entire generation of surrealists, which was called La Chance de Maldoror by Isidore Ducasse, also known as L'Autrement. It was a book from the late 19th century that was read by so few. Almost no copies existed, but a few survived that were read by the right people that wound up being cherished by the surrealists. And he has explicitly nightmarish images of sharks that ravage people after they're in a boat accident and then mate. And then there's images like the chance encounter on a dissecting table of an umbrella and a sewing machine. You don't know what that image is, but it's evocative and it provokes a sense of discomfort and anxiety. That certainly set the tone for all of surrealism. And there is something nightmarish that's built into every one of those stories in his cantos from La Chance de Maldoror. So yeah, that's a good point. Anything else? Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. I'm a pretty big fan of Giorgio de Chirico. Sort of a school of metaphysica was like contemporaneous at the beginning of the surrealist idea, right? So like when Dalí was like working on this like paranoia disposition, right? Characterized by those elements that you mentioned, the long shadows, apropos of that at sunset, and arcaded structures. So like being paranoid was somehow putting you in touch with magic, or that this was somehow operating like Bauhaus and Halloweenish kind of fear-filled environment. You know?
So the comment is about Giorgio de Chirico, who I certainly should have included, because I would say that the kind of haunted, arcades that de Chirico paints in his work are very much like the Beauclerk Isle of the Dead sort of haunted landscapes that you're not sure what's wrong, but you're feeling the anxiety of the image. And I think Dalí and his colleagues, recognize that just as much as they recognize La Chance de Maldoror as the source of incredible both inspiration and a guide into dreams, which I think really did lean towards the nightmarish rather than the, dreams are fun and distracting. It's like, no, it was never that way. It was always dreams are places where we live more fully and at the same time more dramatically and romantically and horrifyingly. But I think de Chirico is a big part of that. And the piece we have upstairs could have just as easily been placed in the nightmare section of the exhibition as it has been in the source of dreams. But yeah, good observation. Any other comments? Yes.
I was just wondering, because when, we did the writings, so that, or scribbles, or whatever, and they felt that painting took too much thought. So at what point did the Surrealists consider painting part of Surrealism and not just
Right, so
writing?
the question is, the first stage of Surrealism, there really was very little place for painters. You know, visual artists were seen as being somehow more, less able to contact their irrational because you're so trained as to how to paint a certain thing and what it represents. There was never that sense of true freedom in the way a visual artist would approach their work compared to a writer. And they were very deeply influenced by the idea of automatic writing and the results that came of automatic writing. But at some point very early on, I think the point that pivoted towards allowing visual artists was the kind of mercurial magic of Max Ernst. Max Ernst was a friend and a member of the group from the very, very beginning. And I know that there were certain members of the group who felt that the visual arts were far too calculating to allow for the kind of freedom that writing allowed. Max Ernst was able to disprove part of that through his collages. And then the other person was André Masson, who had this incredible facility to create what seemed to be automatic drawings, and yet then he would respond to them almost like a Rorschach test, amplify them, and create images that were as compelling as the written words that they were creating. So Salvador Dali enters, 6 years later, after all of these arguments are kind of played out, but he's still very aware that he is such a technically gifted painter. He may also suffer the same challenge that all the visual artists had at the beginning of Surrealism, which is that he was too informed, he was too good. How could he create something that was truly spontaneous if he's, spending this kind of Renaissance style of technique in order to create it? And his argument was that he didn't care if it was an image, if it was a photograph, if it was a found collage, if it was painted. The dream itself was what he was trying to record without worrying about interpreting it. A lot of people don't, in retrospect, find that very, faulty logic, that obviously you're always interpreting every time you approach things. But that's where Dali and many of his colleagues suddenly had an opportunity to present a visual version of this kind of irrational, nightmarish landscape that the visual artists or the visual writers, were exploring in the first part of Surrealism. It seems inevitable. All those writers from the first part of Surrealism, they were all compelled by images like Bocquelin and like Fuseli. So it just seems inevitable. Well, with that, thank you all for coming out today. Give you some ideas for dreams, and thank you.